Welcome, global people, to yet another episode of Two Chaps, Many Cultures. And you guys heard us talk about a lot about how cultural intelligence is also important in global business and how we need to be culture savvy if we're going to work well together across cultures. Well, guess what? There is one profession specifically where I think the rubber meets the road, where cultures might rub each other the wrong way once in a while. That is journalism. Case in point, broadcast journalism. And today we have some special guests here with us who can tell us about cultural competence in the field of news, in the business of news, and how to reconcile different cultural approaches to how the news stories get told. Stay tuned. Good day, mate. How you doing?
Welcome to the broadcast. It's what we're talking about. Broadcasting today. How are you, pal?
I'm doing marvelous. What's the news, man?
Mate, Two Chaps, Many Cultures, episode 201, in the place where too much culture is never enough. How have you been, pal? You back from your wonderful vacation?
I've been gone for a little bit. I've pulled the plug, and it was good. That's all I'm going to say.
Did get that impression. Go back and watch episode 200 if you have any doubt about that. But yes, we are here today talking about broadcasting. We broadcast. We're the #1 show on the business of culture and the culture of business. Maybe we haven't told you that before, but it is. This is the #1 show.
Because we make it so.
Because we say so. I mean, nobody else says so. Anyway, but we have a special guest today that actually got some chops in this field. We're just amateurs, but you know.
Yeah. So finally, after 200 episodes, Daddy Daycare is now inviting an adult into the room who will set us straight and how this is actually done. So welcome to Two Chaps, Many Cultures, Jessica Stone.
Hey, good to be here, and love the banter. Just watch out for me, because I can take him as good as I give him.
Okay, good. Bring it on. Bring it on.
Since that's culturally appropriate, at least in Australia.
Oh, it is, definitely. It's expected. It is expected. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you for joining us. And where are you joining us from today?
The great District of Columbia. I am in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and we have a lot of cultures and a lot of clashes here in D.C.
The land of taxation and no representation. Is that what it is? Oh, something like that. No.
Yes. Although I'm actually in Northern Virginia, where we have a little more representation with our taxation, but we're getting closer to feeling like we don't.
Nice.
So, Jessica, we're happy that you are taking time to be with us today, because we announced you as a broadcasting expert compared to us nincompoops here. So you've been in broadcast for a while. I know you've done broadcasting from areas where people don't necessarily go voluntarily unless they're wearing fatigues and they're there because the government sent them there. And you've done some broadcasting in between cultural fault lines that one wouldn't necessarily expect. So how would you, if we had an elevator ride to the tallest building in DC, that's all the time you get, tell me what you do.
By the way, that's not a very tall building. No building in Washington is allowed to be taller than the U.S. Capitol. So we don't have a lot of floors here in DC. But I would tell you that I feel like I've been a cultural ambassador, both for my country and for my craft, between the U.S. and China primarily, but even before that on the national security front, working in Europe, working in Afghanistan, working in Haiti, working in Brazil. And I have had to wear many hats and speak many languages, whether I could actually speak them or not. And I just underscore the importance of adaptability in this profession and see that so many in our workforce really do need it much more than they may have ever been instructed. I think it's just as important today as arithmetic, budgeting, communication in the office, cross-cultural intelligence is what we all really need to thrive in our current work environment.
Preach it. Preach it.
Holla! Can I get an amen?
There you go.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so, you know this as an Aussie, Brett, the cultures could not be more different between Australia and China, right? And so I've always cultivated the Australian colleagues of mine who could help me understand China. The reality is your communication style could not be more different. I mean, Americans are a little softer even, I would argue, than Australians when it comes to directness. Maybe you'll correct me in just a moment, but the Chinese have such a different method of communication, and I came up against that repeatedly while working with them over about an 8-year period.
Well, Brett, you've done some business in China. Tell us about it.
Yeah, and I would agree with the directness. Although the directness depends, of course, where you are in the US. I'm in the Midwest, and it's a little bit more indirect than it might be on the coastal areas. But our directness comes with a usual salty flavoring of high context. So, and I've mentioned this before, the fact that we use sarcasm and humor to a very liberal degree is something that kind of throws our communications with our American counterparts and colleagues off a little bit. So, and in China, I agree with you. In China, that obviously there's the language barrier you've got to do. So when I've been in a group of Australians in China where you've had to communicate, and using sarcasm and humor there is just definitely off the table. Because so, but wonderful people. I mean, they're just I think the Chinese people are just so wonderfully generous, and that's always been my experience there. And I find it a fascinating place to do business. And I think as somebody like you that's gone there and observed, I guess, a lot of interactions from an external point of view, I would say, what's kind of the process do you think? And I know you probably do this in real time without even thinking about it. It's something you're trained to do. How do you think that from your observation skills, you've been able to take a step back and observe something that you might even disagree with, and be able to put your journalist hat on and say, but I've got to report on this in a very kind of neutral way? What's the process of doing that from a reporter's point of view?
So I think that I believe very, very viscerally that that absolute truth exists, but I also believe that everyone's story deserves to be told. And I think that what we saw 10 years ago is that the Chinese economy was growing and the influence was increasing around the world, but the Chinese story wasn't being told from all angles, and it certainly wasn't being told from the Chinese perspective outside of China effectively. I think they deserve that, and I think that we in the West deserve and require a better understanding of our Chinese colleagues and counterparts around the world, be that in business or government. So my perspective with their stories in particular is that, look, this is a way to help the rest of the world understand a country that is only increasing in size and influence, and that essentially every American and every Westerner and really every African and South American is going to come in contact with in much greater proximity with and in much greater frequency over the next century, and I'm not going to be around for that century, but I would argue at least for the next generation, we're going to be going through these growing pains of how to reconcile the cultural differences between the East, and when I say that, I mean primarily China and the West. And our work is cut out for us. We communicate incredibly differently. And one of my biggest struggles is that while I so love and enjoy telling these stories, I'm an American who really will push for a clear answer from Americans. Like, I want a clear yes or no. So one of the most difficult things about working with Chinese management was that you didn't get a yes or a no. You got a maybe, which was a no, but I didn't take it as a no because I didn't know it was a no for a long time. So, reading between the lines, that very low context style communication, that is very challenging in an environment where news is breaking. You need to make decisions quickly. You need to have a lens with which to apply to a situation. You need to basically have your lines drawn. Hey, this is how we do stories to differentiate our product from other people. That took a long time to get management at CGTN to outline for us. And we got there eventually, I think. But then obviously things have greatly changed in the U.S.-China relationship, and it's become a political football, and it's a pretty tough spot to be a Westerner, I think, now telling those stories from a Chinese vantage point, because the influence is so much stronger from Beijing on what you can say and how you can say it.
Now, let's put some context around this. So you were, if I'm not mistaken, you were the White House correspondent for a Chinese government-owned news network, correct?
Yes, for what had been CCTV and then became China Global Television Network. And left over editorial differences 2 years ago. Very grateful for the experience, learned an awful lot about how China sees itself in the world. And I think that's a really important skill set to bring to people in my book, Crossing the Divide, and in the speaking that I do around that issue, because I really do firmly believe that we need to be able to step into our Chinese counterparts' shoes and understand how they see themselves and how they see the rise of their own country, apart even from the Communist Party, but understanding that the Communist Party has a great deal to do with that. There's a lot of material there, and there's a big gap between how they see themselves and how particularly Washington sees Beijing.
So you didn't only tell the Chinese story from a Chinese vantage point to a Western audience, you also were the American reporter reporting about U.S. or Western politics to a Chinese audience. Is that correct? So you were basically the buffer in both directions.
Yeah, true crosshairs position, to be sure. Yeah, and that obviously came with incredible and increased challenges under the Trump administration. I started under the Obama administration. That was when we had the Asia pivot policy, where you could argue there was an effort to encircle China, building alliances with its neighbors, both militarily and economically, through things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the military alliances. And all of that largely got blown up under the Trump administration, when President Trump thought he could charm his way into making a deal with President Xi. And, you know, initially they did have a very good personal relationship, but I think that personal relationships only go so far when it comes to the ideology that the party faithful, and in particular the leader of the party, Xi Jinping, has. So he's moving the country in a distinct direction. And, you know, just this week we saw, guys, the impacts of the Chinese regulators now on U.S. listed Chinese companies. So this is now coming home to roost in our 401ks and in our pension plan investments. You have to be aware of China's policies and how it sees itself just to plan your retirement these days in America. So
from a Western observer perspective, like the front row observation that you were able to have for such a long time, how does China see itself?
It sees itself as the comeback kid. It is a longtime empire that has suffered greatly, it believes, under Western powers. Think of the Opium Wars 100 years ago, or a couple hundred years ago, and think of you know, the things like the Cultural Revolution in the 1970s, where there was where Mao Zedong, a whole effort to excise intellectuals from government and from places of power and influence. There is a rewriting of history in many ways going on in today's China, where there are periods of Chinese history that people my age and younger don't even know about, that Americans may or may not know about. And so I think understanding that that they are in it for the long game, and they believe that their influence is on the rise and will ultimately demonstrate a better model than democratic capitalism, which is, you know, sort of what we have in the West. That is what they're setting out to prove. And in a lot of ways, you know, you can argue that people in the West misread some of the signals that you could democratize the way that China operates. It's nothing to disparage the Chinese people. I want to be clear about that. While the Chinese government does not like a difference to be made between the Chinese people and its government, there is, I would argue, there is a message from the CCP, and then there is a message from the people of China. They want security, they want prosperity, and if they can get those things through the Communist Party, they're going to do that. But they will reach a ceiling. And you know, you often hear of this golden cage analogy where entrepreneurs, you know, and you can look at Jack Ma of Alibaba as a perfect case example of shooting too high, and that's why the government is really pushing hard to get control of particularly the big data companies, because after Edward Snowden's leaks of WikiLeaks, they understood how vulnerable their companies and their citizens' data were to these big data gathering operations a la Google, Facebook, etc. So there's a lot of interesting pieces there, and I could talk for hours about it, but I think watching the rise of China and seeing the world through their eyes is critical. Michael Schulman has written a really good book. I can get you that in the footnotes about this, and he's still working in Hong Kong. I recommend that book highly.
When you say that the West misunderstood, it was a misunderstanding, I think you said, or underestimation of the Chinese government's approach. To me, and I'm looking at this as a novice or as a person with very limited information about China, but to me, the misunderstanding began with the Beijing Olympics. It was this display of grandeur and comeback kid attitude, however, in a non-threatening way that the West could wholeheartedly embrace and say, look at this great country, China, look at how they've grown up and became successful in their own way. But that is what, 13 years ago, right? So did I do my math right? I thought it was 2008. It's a long time ago, at least.
Yeah.
So did we, which science?
I think it started before that, really. That might be a pivotal point in terms of understanding it, but I think many people would argue that when they joined the WTO under President Clinton in the 2000s, there was a thought that by joining the WTO and accessing the global trade system, they would become adherents to the global trade system, and that hasn't really been what's happened. There's a lot of controversy and discussion around how to work with China in the context of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, but suffice it to say, they have taken advantage of the developing world and developing country carve-outs for how trade is conducted and how much can be subsidized. And it's not a level playing field between them and some of the other members. And they're a big enough economy now where things need to be evened out. And I do think the real crux of the matter for Washington is that there was always this idea when Clinton brought China in, when Nixon went to China even, we'll get them involved and they'll become like us. They don't want to be like us. They want to be Chinese. And the Communist Party wants to be the Communist Party, and they want to do it their way, to quote Frank Sinatra. And they are. And all of the rhetoric coming out of Beijing is, our model works. We vanquished the coronavirus more quickly. We got a vaccine up more quickly. We have a stable economy, and we stabilized the global economy, the last recession, and we avoided a recession this time around. Their message to their people is stick with us and you'll be much more secure than the Western system, which is volatile, which has, elections every 2 to 4 years. There's so much freedom and volatility over there. You don't want that. You want what we have to offer because we're going to give you predictability and stability.
Mm. Do you remember we had an Australian Prime Minister who spoke Chinese fluently, Kevin Rudd, and he's at the Asia Society now, I believe, right? Yeah, that's right. And he was the Chinese ambassador to the Australian ambassador to China for a number of years. And he does a wonderful TED talk about the understanding the Chinese psyche. And I'd recommend, his name is Kevin Rudd. It's a YouTube. I think it's a TED talk, actually. But it is, and that's where was kind of started my journey in understanding and my travels there of observing. And, I do a lot of observing. I like to do this, but really understanding it through the historical aspect and the historical framework of the Chinese mindset. So I really agree with everything you've said there. That's really where that's where the rubber hits the road, as far as really understanding what the Chinese mindset is today through 5,000 or 6,000 years of history. You can't understand today without understanding yesterday in China. It's just impossible to do so. So, I mean, what a fascinating work you've been doing. It's fantastic. And yeah, that's great. And to be able to report on it and educate, I mean, what do you think it's going to take? Really, what do you think it's going to
give the title of the book because it slipped my mind. Michael Schumann did not pay me to promote his book, but who I've interviewed for my own podcasting efforts. Superpower Interrupted. He's, it's a long book, but I think it's well worth it for people who are doing business in China. Sorry to interrupt there, Barry.
No, that's fine. We'll find.
I just mixed your first and last name and called you Barry, Brett. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, that happens. I've been called worse. Don't worry.
Yeah,
I dare say. So, sorry. What was your question, though?
So no, it was just. Go ahead. My question was more. Just so, I mean, what do you think it'll finally take? I mean, when we've got this difference to the much shorter, quick or fast satisfaction framework in terms of business and society that we have here in this country of the USA and a lot of other countries now in this fast moving global economy world, what do you think it's going to take for people to realize and come to the understanding that we have to approach China in a much more, or there are other more productive ways to approach China and engage with them, because we're going to have to engage. I mean, at the end of the day, I look at all the machinations and I look at all the kind of posturing that goes on both sides. But at the end of the day, we have to come to the realization that we are dependent on each other. And I think that the Chinese probably understand that better than anybody, even from
Sure.
We might, I'm talking through a lot of kind of us and them type of mentality. And I want to try and get away from that. As somebody who's observed this, what do you think it's going to take? What kind of education do we need to do as intercultural educators to kind of make people understand, and businesses, professionals understand just what it's going to take to be successful in interacting with this entity?
So that's a really good question, and it's really well framed, because you want to move away from the us versus them construct, right? That's what the politicians are doing. They're going to continue to do that. It's really up to business. It's up to state and local municipalities to keep the relationship strong and to make sure that average Americans understand how much their consumer products, their services, their finances are inextricably tied to Chinese programs of the same. I mean, I mentioned 401ks and pensions. Most of our growth is happening in those funds, in the MSCI index. Most of everyone's money in this country is invested in, many people are invested. I mean, I don't know what percentage, but many people are invested in that index, and it's high growth. It's getting double-digit growth compared to sluggish growth in the West. So, and then you've also got, I had the privilege of going, I guess it's a privilege, I thought it was, to go to the 301 hearings, which was all of the trade hearings under the Trump administration that the U.S. Trade Representative's Office conducted when they accused China of flouting trade rules about subsidies and unfair competition. And it's in those moments when you have purse makers and accessory sellers and bike sellers and car parts sellers and everything you can think of under the sun come and make a presentation and say, look, we need our manufacturing to be able to stay in China. We do not have another place in the world that makes X, Y, or Z. We are in the process, perhaps, of moving it to another place in Southeast Asia. But even then, the expertise is still with Chinese managers. That I heard very loud and clear. And, this generation has gotten used to low-cost goods. We don't pay a lot for toys and purses and bikes and things. And that's because of the way that they're made and where they're made. And whether it's moving it to another country or moving it back on shore, we're going to have a price differential. So Americans not only need to know how their fates are inextricably linked with Chinese, but how, but making decisions about am I willing to pay more if I know that something is made in my country, if I know that something is made according to certain environmental and labor standards? I mean, we're seeing that in the investment space with ESG investing. Will we see that on the ground in the Walmarts of the world? Can Americans even afford to make those kinds of decisions in the Walmarts of the world of, hey, I would prefer to have something without child labor or without environmental implications? We seem to be headed in that direction with some parts of our economy, but will we be able to afford a decoupling? I have a lot of skepticism about those that say we can ever fully decouple. I know for a fact there are factories that are only in China, that were built in China by our manufacturers for example, LED screens in automotives. It's the only place you can make them. We made the upfront investment to build them there. We don't have another factory to make them there. The auto dealers will tell you.
You said the word decoupling,
but it's going to take, it's going to take a while.
You used the word decoupling. I want to.
Yeah, the buzzword, right?
I want to throw it in there because, yes, I would agree with you that that level of decoupling will be interesting to see how and if it will materialize once the West recognizes that it will hit their purses first if that decoupling happens. Now, we're now in a period of politics or military geostrategic politics where the West has decided to decouple itself from Afghanistan. And that is a country that you also saw hands-on. I guess you didn't go where the rubber meets the road. I guess you went to where the rubber hit the gravel.
Rock. This picture on the front of my book is from the Hindu Kush Mountains. These are the foothills of the Himalayas. And it's just gorgeous. I mean, the closest I can say the air is to a European country is Swedish air. It has that high northern clarity, no pollution. But yeah, it's been challenging to watch this withdrawal going on of our forces from Afghanistan after 20 years, really wondering what's going to happen to the people that I still keep in touch with in Afghanistan, in particular the minorities that helped me very much in my reporting journey there and really shaped a lot of my reporting. Thinking about the little girl, I have a picture in my Afghanistan chapter. Oh, this little girl captured my heart.
While you find that girl, I'm curious, what brought you there? You told me in a previous conversation that you basically sent yourself there, and I'm not sure how much of that was an exaggeration, but what makes a young reporter choose to go to Afghanistan? What was the motivation behind it?
I wanted to understand. I wanted to get on the ground and see the military action place. I went in 2009. We'd already been there, for almost 10 years. And we were making an assessment under the Obama administration of whether to stay. And obviously we did stay. But at the time, that was very much up in the air. We were, I was about to cover the first Karzai election. And yeah, I don't have a close up of her, but she's in this group picture right here, which is not very visible on the screen there. I won't bore you with it, Afghanistan to me is it's a beautiful country. It truly is, as Seth Jones says, the graveyard of empires, though, and I think that is what President Joe Biden explicitly said repeatedly today during his announcement of why we're leaving, that we've done what we can, not just the US, but coalition partners from Australia to Italy to France to Canada to the UK to train the Afghan troops.
Germany a little bit.
Germany a little bit. But this has been tried before. Russia didn't win. The Taliban didn't win. Other efforts at conquering the country, and it's never really been a united country because it is effectively a bunch of tribes. So I can understand the arguments both ways, but my heart truly goes out to the people that are the most persecuted minorities, as well as the women who have a lot to lose here. If they don't leave the country, some of them are never going to finish an education. Some of them are not going to become the leaders, the doctors, the lawyers that their country needs.
So you showed us your book already. You wrote a book about your experience, right? And instead of calling it Closing the Culture Gap, it's called Crossing the Divide, which I like even better because it is, I think the word divide is, in the English language at least, I think it expresses a more separational state, right? So it's really, there's something cut in between.
Yeah, I think it acknowledges that there are differences without saying that that you can't cross over to each other. And I think that's an important message, frankly, internally in our country as well.
So what do we expect in that book? I have to admit, I haven't had a chance to read it yet. It will be the next one on the list. So what does it learn?
And it's not a long read. You'll see it's got a narrow spine here. It's 150 pages. It's very introductory for people to get them acquainted with a bunch of different countries, how to approach them. I have lessons at the end of each one that I think are broadly applicable to many countries and to many cultural differences. I do spend a lot of time on Eastern countries like Vietnam and China. And I spend a good bit of time in France as well. I studied and worked at frontlines in France. I wrote it because I had been asked so repeatedly about Afghanistan, and I wanted to communicate what led me to go there, some of the things I learned about being there culturally, but also being there logistically. You're putting up on the screen, Crossing the Divide, 5 key ideas. That first one is the first lesson. So I have 20 different lessons, and you'll get 5 of the lessons right here during our podcast here. You need to understand your own culture before you understand another one. I mean, you guys know this. We all have a frame of reference. If you don't understand where the lines are around your own frame of reference, it's going to be much more difficult for you to compare other cultures to your own. And a lot of Americans, I would argue in particular, don't really have that. If you haven't traveled or been exposed to different parts of the country or different cultures within the country or different nationalities from outside the country, or people who are hyphenated Americans who have perhaps been they're first generation Americans, but they've been raised by parents from another culture. I mean, all of these things are the beautiful tapestry of our country, but acknowledging the differences and how we communicate differently under those constructs is really, it's a skill set. And it's one I know you guys work with companies around the world on. But our young people, Gen Z, millennials coming out of college in your first or second jobs, I mean, I want to speak directly to them right now. You are working more remotely, more cross-culturally than any generation before you. You need to know how to make connections with people different from yourself and not judge them for those differences, but learn how to work with them through those differences to accomplish the goal that makes the company, accomplish what it needs to accomplish and what it's promised its clients. You're going to have to handle clients from East Africa differently than South America, differently than Europe. I mean, people have different concepts of time, as you know. And this issue of high context, low context communication is, I think that's really, I talk a lot about that in my presentation because that's huge, right? Being able to read between the lines versus having to
real quick. Sorry to jump on you like this, Jessica.
Go for it.
This key idea number 3. This is something that Brett and I and everyone else in our field is obviously harping on. Now, going by your experience as a broadcast journalist in a country that is famously divided across many things,
which one are we talking about now? Afghanistan or China?
The U.S.
Or U.S. That's perfect.
We're talking about and probably many other countries in the world.
And
so how do we, in your experience, how do we succeed in finding the commonality rather than putting the emphasis on that which divides us? How do we set our minds to become detectives in search for the commonality?
So I know that the way I've had to approach that is it's always my goal to earn the trust of somebody that's new that I need information from, right? In the case of people in business, you're doing business with people, whether it's it's on the project management side or it's on the client management side, because you need something from them. You need their trust too. So what are the things that are universal to humanity? We like sports, we like entertainment. Most of us have families. We might travel. There are things that are common to the human experience that you can exploit and ask about. And it's a longer, less quote unquote effective way to talk to somebody. You can't just go right to the point about what you want to talk to them about today. You're going to have to do the sort of 3 cups of tea, another book, right, from Afghanistan approach, where you're building trust, you're building commonality, and that's most helpful. That's really helpful in all cultures, but I argue really mostly in the Eastern cultures. You will have to spend much more time up front investing in the relationship, getting to know people. And I would start a Google spreadsheet, who likes what soccer team or football team, who likes, who has what kids studying where, what are their hobbies, where do they like to travel? Those are all things that you guys, you can build relationships over.
Yeah.
Where do we find the book? Where do people get them?
We're currently held on Amazon. I'm working on getting it into independent bookstores as well. That is a work in progress. So hopefully by the end of the summer, we'll be there as well. I'd welcome your feedback. Please do me a favor. If you purchase the book on Amazon, leave a review. I want to hear from you what works, what doesn't work, what you thought was redundant, whatever your feedback is. If you find it helpful, we'd love to hear from you, because I've certainly been helped in just codifying all of the things I've learned in this, and you will get the 5 lessons and more if you do so.
Nice.
There's a set of snake knives that go with it.
Yes, no Ginzu knives, but we do have an ebook and a paperback. It's low cost; it's under $15, and would love to have you read it, recommend it, and I'd love to come and speak to any of your groups that want to learn more about this skill set, because I do really believe in passing it on.
Yeah. All right. From somebody who's modeled it, experienced it, and teaching it with true print on the page. We have a link in the comments to the Amazon. It seems to have succeeded getting through on Facebook and YouTube. Not sure about LinkedIn, but maybe we'll add those later.
Just go search "Crossing the Divide," Jessica Stone, and it'll take you right to it.
Absolutely.
Now,
you got it.
Obviously, you put yourself in a frame by design, not by accident. So there's a few pictures that I can barely see, but that picture to your right, is that Madeleine Albright in that frame?
Oh, that is Ted Koppel.
Ted Koppel.
That's Ted Koppel. Madeleine Albright.
That's how bad my eyes are. How small my screen is.
Yeah. Well, they both have curly hair, we could say. I have a great story about Madeleine Albright, though. When I was a student and we were touring Eastern Europe, we actually went to the synagogue, I believe, in Czech Republic, where she discovered that she had Jewish ancestry. And it was just really neat to be connected to her in that way. And I have a lot of Washington friends who've worked at the Stonebridge Albright Group, which she founded on Foreign Affairs. What a lady. She wrote books in her attic while she still had young children. I'm writing them in my basement instead, but I look up to her to be sure.
Hilarious. So for those of us who live, I mean, the 3 of us live in the US, a lot of our viewers reside in North America. Living in the epicenter of the political continuous hurricane, how do you keep your sanity in a city run by division? How do you manage that? Well,
the pandemic helped because I got to not see as much of the division outside my 4 walls, but I certainly saw it on my screen and in all the media I was consuming. I'm working my way through that. That is a work in progress. And I think it helps to get out of this area for me and to be in touch with other parts of the country, because this is very much a bubble. And, some of us, including myself, may have been here too long to see things from other perspectives. That's a key part of being culturally intelligent, I should say. Getting out of your own comfort zone. I actually have a saying I like to say: burst your bubble. because we all inevitably have it, right? And the only way to understand other perspectives is to pop it and get out of it.
Well, here's a cultural question, because I actually would frame, say, the cultural practice or the cultural teaching that has formed the journal. I think there's a journalistic culture, right? And that has evolved. You know, I remember, this is terrible to say this, in the good old days, you know, I remember, you know, when you watched the news, you got facts, you got what happened today. This is what happened. There was very little, you know, opinion was reserved for other mediums.
In the States, not in the Australian media, though.
I'm sorry?
You've had in the Australian media, you've been allowed to have more opinion than the old, you know, than 50 years ago in the States.
Yeah. Well, I'm just kind of observed journalists, and I don't know, for people that are going into journalism now that see, I kind of, and I don't know anybody going into journalism. I could just imagine trying being that age and going into that, and probably with great ideals and fascination for the craft, but then being almost forced to choose a side before you even start, right? You've got to choose a side, right? And it seems to me that there are some obviously really great, intelligent, well-meaning people in the journalism field, but they're pushed by this culture from who they are employed by, or, you know, how do we get over that? That seems to me that we're in this spiral to the bottom.
Yeah.
You know,
and I've watched, because I came into journalism after what I would say is the heyday of broadcast journalism in the 80s. I came into it in the early 2000s. And by then, budgets were nowhere near as fat as they were in the 80s. That was really a plush time to be in broadcast media. You know, even local stations were covering wars, were sending people to Vietnam and such. I think two things. I think the genesis of this is the commercialization of media, where in order to get eyeballs, we're selling perspectives. That was obviously pioneered by Roger Ailes at Fox News Channel. But even before that, there were subtle opinions. They just became much more visceral through the lens of cable news. And that was a winning formula for Fox. And it's certainly one that CNN and MSNBC have followed, arguably with a different spin on politics, and taking a certainly very obvious position, particularly during the presidency of President Trump, as did Fox News, of course. The other thing I would say is that what I'm observing about young journalists is that they think they're supposed to have an opinion, and they think that they're supposed to tell everybody their opinion, and that objectivity is not the goal. That I find very troubling, because my contention is that the reason that this profession is the only one in the U.S. Constitution, the fourth estate, is that democracy falters without a responsible journalism community, a responsible press, in that, and the democratic experiment does not work the way it is supposed to work when we take sides. So I don't know how to solve that problem. I think we are seeing a number of attempts through subscription media and alternative media. You're seeing things like Substack and Patreon, where you are going to subscribe to the media that you think is, the best media. Of course, for some people, that's going to be still opinionated media, and for others, it's going to be hard-hitting investigative journalism. That's where we're seeing a lot of the really good investigators go, is to Substack, and you pay to get their newsletters. But the problem with that is it further fragments society. And we saw over the last election cycle how many people around the country got their news from Facebook, and much of it was not fact, it was fiction. So I don't think that helps the democratic experiment. And I don't know how to solve it. I know there are many people who are trying, and I think it's important that we support those efforts. If you think about what you're willing to pay for, are you more willing to pay for the cable package that gives you the same treatment on different sides, and you can balance it in your own head? Or are you looking for independent voices that are going to walk a different path through the facts and help you navigate them, maybe more in a longer format, like a podcast, or in a longer written piece, or in something that they're reading to you, an audio version? I think the beauty is we have with digital journalism so many opportunities to get to people in different ways and make our way of telling stories as compelling as possible. And we have to argue the case. We can't just go tell stories for story's sake. I think that I've really come up against that challenge because that Afghanistan trip was a freelance trip. I had to sell every story, to sell individual editors on every story. And then I had to complete the story through the editing process, all in a war zone with insecurity and financial insecurity all at once. So it was a very stressful situation. But I think a lot of journalists and young people, they may just not be up for that challenge. They might want stability. They might want predictability. And so we want to make sure that the people with the bright minds are going into this trying to figure out a way forward. It's important to our country.
And if I'm trying my best to tie these two ends together as we finish up this episode, which is quite hard to do even in my head. But I think just as much as we can't take cultural understanding for granted, it takes our active participation, our curiosity in doing our part to learn and comprehend and engage and embrace the difference. The same way it applies to being responsible in our news consumption and really not taking it for granted that whoever is presenting it to me must be right because they're just distributor of the truth or the truth. No, it behooves us as the recipients to take an active role into how we consume information. Just like we can't simply go into Afghanistan, China, Australia, Germany, wherever, and simply assume that it will all be the way we expected and the way we wanted. I think the same way.
I think that Generation Z and millennials are leading the way on that. I think it's up to the older generations to follow. It's their skepticism and their desire to uncover truth and really their disgust with the idea that anybody behind the anchor desk is an authority of any kind that's driving the economic impetus to give them a different product, to give them something more transparent, give them something more engaging and interactive. But we still have to have a North Star in that process. And I think that's engagement, but it's also the belief that is fundamental to our Western society. And I talk about this in the book. The West is built on the concept of absolute truth. This is something from Socrates and Plato. We believe that there is something to be found and something to be exposed, whether it looks different from different perspectives, but you can't just reinvent the truth every time you want to have a different government agenda, as some of our neighbors around the world prefer to look at it as.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jessica, smart words. There'll be many more smart words in your book. So folks, get the book, Crossing the Divide, Jessica Stone. Find it on Amazon. Find it in the comment box below this video, wherever you're watching it. And if it's not there during the live broadcast, we'll add it on later because guess what? You'll be able to watch this as many times as you want. Jessica, thanks for joining us today. I'm still waiting for the dog to jump into the frame, but apparently Doggy decided not to do that.
No, she's underneath my chair, very, very quietly hanging out, which I'm very appreciative because this puppy has been a handful. So.
Thank you so much. Much success to you. Keep up the great work. Now I'm sounding like my dad, so scratch that. Can we edit that out? I'm sorry.
No editing. We're live.
And Brett, thank you for the work that you guys do, and you keep up the great work. And I'll sound like your dad because I'm grateful to know people like you are out there. I think it's critical, as you know. I'm passionate about it. So thank you for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure. So Two chaps, many cultures. Two chaps, many cultures, and one great broadcast journalist with cultural competence, and a book called Crossing the Divide. And we're out for now. See you in the next episode.
Bye, guys.
Bye.